Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eileen Donovan. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement with the Lyman Allyn Art Museum and have been thrilled to help host and welcome people through the exhibition Blue Seeds Reflections on Foster Care by Jac Lahav through the museum. It opened August 26th, and we're approaching the final weekend. It's closing after Sunday. So if you're in town and joining us, hopefully you can sneak in another visit this coming weekend. It's been very rewarding to have it on view this fall. So, artist Jac Lahav works with immersive vining sculptures and abstract painting that intertwine the themes of fostering and the nurturing power of plants. Through vibrant blue installations that envelop and beguile, Lahav encourages viewers to explore the complex layers of human connection and growth. And I'm going to leave it very brief so that we can pass it to Jack and start to hear more about this show and your work.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I see some friends here. Um, I am basically going to give um, a woven narrative of what this show is about. And we're going to weave together different ideas of foster care and painting, and then the show in specific. And I hope what we're going to leave with is a better understanding of where I'm coming from in making this work, and then a better understanding of the concepts behind the work, and then some of the materiality of the work. So what it's actually made out of in paint and felt and all the little goodies. So so Abshalom Jac Lahav, that's my given name, or actually my middle name was Yaakov, which we changed to Jacob, and then shortened to Jack. And so it's actually an interesting note on identity, is that a lot of my work is about identity, and the Jack is the Americanization of a name that we did when I was young, and now I'm going through the world and a lot of people are calling me Jacques. And I think it's really interesting that there's this like re-foreignization of an Americanized name. And so that's where that's where I find names and labels really interesting, and that works a lot into some of my earlier portrait work. Um, oh, too far. So I went to Brooklyn College in 2006, and while I was there, I started this series called 48 Jews. It was over 48 paintings of Jews in the diaspora, and sort of looking at what it means to be Jewish. I was born in Israel. I was raised in America. I'm not particularly religious, but tradition and being Jewish is a big part of my identity. And so I was looking online, seeing who else is Jewish or who are notable Jews. And I started finding interesting things, like Elvis Presley has four generations of maternal Jewish descent. So in Jewish law, maternal descent is what makes part of what makes you Jewish. But Elvis Presley is not Jewish, and he was raised Baptist, I believe. And so, what does that mean? Versus someone like Anne Frank or Hannah Arendt is the portrait on the left. What are the tweezings between identity, how we form our identity, how the world labels us in our identity? So I also found online Cindy Sherman was on a list of famous Jews. And that didn't really sit right with me. So I emailed her, and she was gracious enough to email back and said, "No, I'm actually as waspy as they get." And I was like, that's so interesting. And I guess she had shown at the Jewish Museum at one point in New York and had gotten on a list of famous Jews because of that. And so on the right, we see a selection. This work was picked up by the Jewish Museum New York, and it's a selection that's still up in their permanent collection right now, of the series. So after the 48 Jews, I started this work called The Great Americans. Been working on it for over, I don't know, 10, maybe 14 years now. And it's life size or larger than life, about 7 foot tall portraits of famous Americans. Um, And so we won't talk too much about portraiture here because that's not what this show is about. But this is it's sort of an interesting point in how the divergence of an artist can happen, and how, as I was saying, weaving, this idea of woven, these vines growing is a repeated theme. Here we have um, an example of a work, Fidelia Hoscott Smith Fielding. She is an interesting character. She was one of the last, or she was the last person to speak the Mohegan language. And now they're using her diaries to rekindle the language. And so this was for a show at the Slater Museum. And I started integrating these vines into the work. And I was just talking about the vines in terms of the vines are growing and they're always trying to find a path. And I talk a lot about journeys and this idea of like the ladder. Like for our career, we think that there should be a ladder, that it should be, you know, you get a job, you move up in the career, but that's not most people's experiences. And it's much more like a road trip, or like these growing vines, like they grow out in different directions and you never really know where they're going to hit. And so that's both an analogy for my own career. So I started out with portraiture, and now this show is that I'm going to talk about now is extremely different. Um, but also for this talk, that it's kind of weaving and meandering, and I'm going to give you lots of information. Here is the Slater Museum show integrating the vines into the work, into the portrait work, and the vines will come back around at the end of this talk as well. If you've seen the museum, the Lyman Allyn show, which is what I'm talking about now, the vines play a big role in that. So 2019 saw a big shift in my practice. It was right before COVID. I had this show at the Florence Griswold Museum for portraits. And in the back room, they asked me to curate a show from their collection. So I really was looking at my palettes a lot at the time, my artist palettes. And so I curated a whole wall filled with their historical artist palettes and my artist palettes. And I find palettes to be so interesting. They're both like beautiful objects, but they also tell a history. And I love the idea of something that is on the surface a beautiful object, but also has this depth to it. And that's like in the portraiture, like a portrait is a surface of an object, but then the content behind it is, you know, is this huge content of somebody's life. And so palettes are also like, they're a beautiful surface. It sort of reminds me of a Turner painting, maybe, that like it's very washy and atmospheric, but it's also telling the story of the creation of a painting. And so out of looking at palettes, I developed this series that I call Meditations or Broken Paintings. And I'll get into these a little bit more later, but this is sort of indicative of the abstract work that came out of that Florence Griswold show. And this is the one from the center gallery in the Lyman Allyn show. I did a large abstract. So this is sort of the direction that the abstracts went in. So now on to fostering and painting. During COVID, I did a few things. I started being, you know, as most people in quarantine, I was much more introspective. Some people became sourdough people. I became a succulent person. I really started looking at my plants and using them as a point of nurturing and care, and thinking about plants as analogies for care. I do a lot of care in my life of other people, and I look at plants sort of as an analogy and trying to understand what care means. Like we talk about the idea of journey and the ladder. So let's talk about family for a second and fostering. Most people think about family in terms of, okay, two people meet, they have a kid grows up. Even that, like even two people meet and have a kid, you can unpack that for a whole hour talk. But kid grows up, kid reaches 18, kid moves out, and you know, and happily ever after they come back once every Thanksgiving and have a nice meal. all right, that's not most people's experience of a family. And families can, range the gamut from a grandma who's raising their grandkid as the primary caretaker to, that nuclear family that we just talked about, the whole communities raising children, or raising, kids have also much different needs from when they're like infants to 4 year olds to up to the teens. And so my wife and I started on a fertility journey that kind of went south, didn't really do what we wanted it to. And that's also another hour-long talk, is the idea of fertility and fertility myths in America. But instead of dealing with fertility, we decided to move on to fostering. We had some friends that did fostering, and let's see. And we heard this number that there are 3,000 kids in Connecticut, which is where we reside, that are in foster care. And these are kids that, range in age and range in the help that they need. And we decided, maybe we'll start getting into foster care. And when we heard about it, we sort of understood that there were three different sections to fostering. There's foster to adopt, which is what we hope to do. We hope to bring a new child into our family and keep them permanently. We've since learned that it's much more complicated than that, that foster care in Connecticut has a mandate towards reunification. So the foster to adopt is sort of it's like a unicorn situation in the foster situation. But it does happen. And so that's also tied to long-term fostering, which is longer than like a week, versus emergency placements, which my wife and I also do. We do all three at this point. We've been in fostering for 2.5 years, I think, and we've done all three. Emergency placements is like dad gets drunk and has the kids in the back seat. He gets sent to jail for the night. The kids need someplace to go. They would come to our house and we would watch them for a day until DCF, that's the Department of Child and Families, figures out what they are going to do. Is there a grandma that will take them? Did dad get out of jail? What's the situation? And then the kids move on to something else. So then there's respite care, and that's the last one. And that's if a foster family like ours needs a break, or let's say we need to go on an international trip and our kid did not have a passport, then the foster kid could go to another foster family, and it's kind of a glorified babysitting. Usually everything's like kind of okay. It's just like, having a grandparent or someone else that's a caretaker take care of the kid for a short amount of time, like a week, until you get your things done. So we've done all three. And when we started with the foster to adopt, that's what we really thought we were in it for. We started getting lots of phone calls. And the phone calls ranged from our first phone call, I think, was, oh, we have two kids, ages like 1 and 3, and the 3-year-old just bit another kid in the foster family that they're currently in, and so they need to move. Like, that foster family doesn't want them in the house anymore. And would you be willing to take them? And we look deep inside and say, is this something we want to do or not? We already, at the time, that was our first call. I am a very skittish person. And so I said, no way, we already have a 5-year-old in the house. I don't want to bring in a small kid that's known for biting. What's it going to do to our already bio kid? And so we started getting these phone calls, and it started raising all these questions of like, what am I capable of? What am I getting into? What is the future going to be if I say yes? We got a phone call for an infant with severe shaken baby syndrome. Like, what does that mean? Really tough questions. And so I started basically documenting the phone calls, meaning I would just write down every time we got a phone call and any information that we got. And then and then meditating on them and trying to think about, what does this mean for me in my life? And so remember the 48 Jews, like you can't really get much farther from the fostering. Um, and I started thinking, I want to bring that fostering into my work somehow. But with these kids, I'm getting phone calls and I don't have faces to put to their names. And then B, we did get emergency placements, but I'm not allowed to take pictures of them because they're not my children. So I don't actually have any, there's this idea of ownership in parentage, but I don't really have any rights as a foster parent. So how can I, represent this story? um, I also started thinking about representing the story in terms of, I wanted to make sure I was representing my story and not the kid's story, because I don't really have the ownership to talk about what the kids are going through, which is a whole other bag. But I can talk about what I was going through as a caretaker, and as a foster worker. So remember the abstracts. Here we have Fidelia on the left again, in work in progress. We have the abstracts, and I started working on these abstracts, and that were basically they're all on printed velvet as a substrate. So again, now we were just talking about content, and we can go into materiality. But first, I just want to say, what I did was I decided to start making a painting for every call that we got. So right now there are about 46 paintings in the series. I think I have another 5 to make in the studio. But basically, there's a painting for every phone call that we received on about a foster child. And so the paintings, in my mind, they sort of become a visual journal. They're also, in a way, memories, like plasticization of a memory. Um, and so this is an install shot from the first gallery in the Lyman Allyn Museum. And we hung them chronologically in order. So these are all chronological from left to right in terms of when we got the phone call. Here's a little bit more of a close-up. And so I'll talk 2 seconds about the materiality. So this central image that looks kind of like a seed, which is maybe why we called the show Blue Seeds, or some people say maybe an embryo. Some people think they look like glass vessels. And so the central image is paint. It's an acrylic and vinyl paint called Flash. And then the background is a printed gradient on velvet. So if you see on the one on the left, the upper left-hand side is much lighter than the bottom right-hand side. And that's a printed gradient on the velvet. So it's the velvet itself has that coloring to it. And I thought it just added a lot of depth to the image. And I get the velvet printed at a place in London, and then I bring it back to the studio and I gesso an object in the center, because you have to gesso the velvet in order to work on it. And then I start painting into it and making very like gestural and immediate paintings. And so to me, it's sort of interesting that I'm making these gestural and immediate paintings but they're also like thought out and labored. Like I have to make the original gradient image. I have to get it printed. I have to gesso on the canvas. Like this isn't the immediacy of the phone call that I receive. And I think that, I don't know, that to me in art is sort of an interesting thing, is like making something that is labored look easy is like a cool thing. Here's a close-up of one of the paintings. You can see the line here next to this big white line, but is the background is the velvet, and then the paint becomes pretty gloopy. And I love this idea of paint being a liquid and then it solidifies into a solid. That's actually part of what really interests me in portraiture too, is this idea that the portrait is like a solid snapshot. It's like an image of one point in time versus this like fluid aspect of a person's life. Like our lives are very fluid, and our histories are even fluid in how we see them and how we grow to understand them. But the portrait itself is a static snapshot. And so it's this plasticization, this made physical of a liquid or a mercurial idea. All right, so the Lyman Allyn Museum, 3 galleries in 3 acts. So when the Lyman Allyn came to me, I came to them, and they came to me, and we came together, and we decided to use their top 3 galleries as the show. And I wanted to sort of have 3 different acts. And so the first act is the Foster paintings. Only the Foster paintings in the first gallery. They line the wall from left to right chronologically, and each of them is representing a different phone call I received for foster care. The center gallery has the side of Foster paintings, but in the center, I have one of those big abstracts that I talked about earlier. As I show you the big abstract from earlier, these I started when I started making them. Let's see. Yeah, so I was referencing this palette, and I started making this abstract form and having it be very watery and very like built up and have a history of the paint built up, but it still wasn't enough. So what I did was I added a broken line onto the surface, and that broken line is done in 24 karat gold leaf. And so that act of putting the line on, one aspect of it is a reference to kintsugi pottery. And kintsugi pottery is when it's a Japanese art of when a vessel breaks, you repair it with gold enamel. And it's both a meditation on repair and a meditation on the beauty that we can find in healing. And so this giant painting that I made specifically for that back wall, it's a triptych, and so the this form here of the, it sort of looks like a figure eight, is, it all has that like kintsugi brokenness to it. And I was just giving a talk to the docents at the Florence Griswold Museum yesterday, and we were brainstorming like, what does it look like? Maybe it looks like DNA. And there's this idea of like DNA attached to fostering and nurturing. Someone said it looks like an infinity, and it's sort of it's an infinity symbol that's also going to the left and the right, like it's continuing. And you have this idea like the vines, this continuation of the journey. Um, so those were a few interesting things. And then in the final gallery, I really wanted to do something that was more engaging, especially to children and families, because this work is about the art, but it's also integral to being about children and families, because that is exactly what I'm doing. So we still hung some Foster paintings on the wall to continue it, but I created this lounge, this blue lounge. And in the blue lounge, we carpeted. I put these beanbag chairs in that have this evil eye motif on them. The evil eye is a superstitious symbol from the Mediterranean region. My grandmother had a bunch of them, but it's called evil eye, but really it's to keep away evil spirits or the bad vibes, which is something that I need a lot of, is keeping away the negativity and trying to always look at the positive. And that's part of what this evil eye keeps coming up about. It's in part, it's a reminiscence to my grandmother. Also, the plants is a reminiscence to my grandmother, where she had a lot of succulents in her house. And so this plant is another part of that like growth. And so the plant is also growing up, and we'll see in a second, but it's growing through the walls of the museum. And that is in part talking about this continuation and this weaving of the narrative past the one room. Um, and so this is the room in action, inviting kids and adults to come and sit and sort of vibe with the work. And there are these weird little cat bookshelves, which we could also spend an hour talking about why I make weird little cat bookshelves, but that's a different story. All right. So, oh, this got cut off. But first gallery is Act One, and I consider that the past. It's about our history. It's all about the phone calls, and in part, it's also about the trauma of the past. Second gallery is about the present. It has this large sort of kintsugi type painting on it that's really talking about healing and how do we find a way forward. And the last gallery is the future. That's the finding the way forward. And this is how do we look at the future? How do we understand where we can go, where we can go? You know, not just where we are going, but what are the different possibilities, and not being closed to saying that our narrative has to be normative. So I'll just give you a quick video. This seems to be playing. So this is a quick walkthrough of the show. It starts out, there's a little bit of text telling people that it's in 3 acts. There's an abstract painting. And then we have on the outside walls some of these vines growing up and through the walls. So sort of like the vines and the show itself is taking over the whole museum. This idea of growth and again, also non-normative growth, right? That it doesn't have to be what a museum normally is. And that's something we'll talk about at the end with a different engagement thing we did during the show, but that we can really reach outside of our boundaries and find a lot of growth. There's a little close-up of one of the Foster paintings. And the color's relatively off because I took this with my new phone, but the phones are doing pretty good in their camera abilities. In all, I think there's about 32 of the Foster paintings in this show. We didn't want to squeeze them too much into the show, and curatorially, it's interesting. Like, if you don't give them enough space, then they really all become one painting. But if you give them a little bit of space, then people can really appreciate them individually as paintings. There was a little close-up of the gold leaf on one of the, I call them broken paintings sometimes, but they're really meditations. I find them like a return to the aesthetic. And that's sort of what's interesting to me, is that a lot of this work, oh, there's some more vines on the top. A lot of doing abstract work is sort of a return to the aesthetic. Even though I'm cramming it filled with content, they're still aesthetic objects. And that's, again, talking about the curation and giving them some space allows them to be their own paintings and therefore aesthetic objects in their own right. And so how do you marry this? Ooh, there. No. All right. This one I'll talk about a second. So, oh, let's see. I want to talk about this guy for a second. So I couldn't have a show of just abstracts. That might have driven me nuts, having been such a figurative painter for such a long time. So I added in this painting of it's called Foxy, but it's actually of a black-backed jackal. And black-backed jackals are one of the animals in nature who are known for something called alloparenting. And alloparenting is when an animal is taking care a of a child animal that isn't their immediate relative. So a black-backed jackal will take in a baby from another pack and raise it as part of their pack. And I thought that that's such a beautiful thing, that this idea of fostering is done in the animal kingdom as well, and it's a natural thing to take care of others. And then we come upon the third act and the lounge with the beanbag chairs. There's a small grouping of foster paintings on the side. We can talk about the flowers later on too. Um, the flowers are also references to the foster children, and I love this idea of like blooming, like we understand a plant through its blooms sometimes. And then I wanted to share this little wink um, at the back of the sculpture. I made a little hidden jungle, and that little furry purple thing is giving off bird sounds. So when you walk into the room, you have this sort of meditative tweeting. And I love this idea of wonder versus surprise. And so you come in, and wonder is like the big idea, and then surprise is like these little moments. And the show sort of ends on that stork painting, and the stork as the symbol um, for renewal and bringing babies into the world, which is such a weird thing that we have this stork-like bird responsible for bringing children to families. I need to look more into the history of that. All right. So we're almost done with the talk, and we can have a few questions at the end. But I just wanted to briefly talk about another engagement event. So I really love the idea of the lounge and sort of turning the museum, the traditional museum, on its head. So kids are allowed to come in and sit and engage with the books and really enjoy the artwork on a different level. And so I was like, well, what if there was like a whole other level that we can engage children with? And so this was a show that I had at the Sugarlift Gallery in Chelsea, New York. And what I did was I replaced one of the central paintings here with a painting, but instead of canvas, I used paper mache as the surface. And instead of hollow, I filled it with candy, and I invited kids to come and smash it during the run of the show. Um, and we have a big talk with the kids and say, this is about permission, and this is about and what we are doing here. We're at once doing a celebration and saying you can have a lot of fun in a museum or in a white box gallery, but also that like this is something special that we're doing at the moment. And the idea that like you see this level of smiling children at a museum or a white boxed space is pretty amazing. I feel like it's pretty disruptive. Like I don't see smiles like this often in museums. And so here is the room of the present at the museum, the room of the healing and the present. And that center image I replaced with we call them smash art paintings, but and I let the group of kids tear into it, and their minds were blown when we told them that they were going to be allowed to engage with the painting in this way. And what we're not talking about is my penchant for weird cats, so I will just leave that there as the end. And then after the event, we cleaned it all up and replaced the painting back. I was thinking for a time that we might leave the broken painting up there, legitimately broken now, not just me calling this a broken painting. But we decided that it would take away too much from the other content of the show. And that's where we stand. So that was a quick talk, but Allyn, if you want to come in, I don't know if people have questions.
Yeah, if any folks have questions, feel free to pop on either verbally, either ask the question or turn on your video if you want, or you can put things into the chat. But I had a question about the stork painting. I've obviously spent a couple of months now with the exhibition, and there was one of the seed paintings, the foster care paintings, where you said that it had this little growth out of a mistake. But I realized that the stork had very similar shapes. Was that at all an intention of the
Yeah,
kind of? Hmm.
definitely intentional.
Hmm.
I love the idea of intentional mistakes, right? You have a
Hmm.
something that went awry and then you turn it into something and then you're like, oh,
Hmm.
that's actually really beautiful. And
Yeah.
the stork painting itself, I was thinking a lot about the they were sort of like these like puffy little flowers on the top of
Hmm.
a long thin vine, and I think a lot about Calder,
Mm.
the art historical reference. So that like the idea of his mobiles,
Hmm.
um, and how they're really showing movement and space. And his paintings also are sort of referring to that three dimensionality of movement in space, um, and I kind of
Hmm.
like that now. So yeah, I wanted to bring that into the painting more.
Wonderful. Um, Cynthia, you turned on your video. Do you have a question?
Actually, it's more of a comment. Um, it's, I follow Jack on Instagram, and I've seen a lot of these photos that have just been from, these, every week or every whatever they come through, and I could not actually ever see how they wove together until, which is really cool to see the fact that he has this three-part show and it has past, present, and future, but also all these other things. So, oh, of course, I'm getting a call. Excuse me. Um, I actually have my phone on. It won't go to voicemail. There it goes. Okay. Anyway, um, one of the things that as artists hear a lot is that you have to find a style and stick with it so that you have this memorable thing. And I have always believed that if art is about being creative and doing what you want to do, and yet there still persists this thing in the art world that you have to be this one thing that when people see your painting they say, oh, that's a Jac Lahav there, or that's a Picasso or something. And I think that Jac, more than any other person I've come in contact with, it really embodies that spirit of just saying. And I also have to say, when he said that he's a little bit of a scaredy cat person, where he was I can't remember his exact words, but I just had to laugh because I think he seems very courageous to me. So those are my comments. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I definitely, I am in my family. I'm the pessimist, and I'm the I'm the hesitant one. And I work really hard to be an optimist and courageous, and it doesn't come easy. And I think that's a great lesson, I think, for everyone, is that, I'm also an introvert and I do so many extroverted things, and it doesn't come easy. Um, I do a lot of professional development, speaking, and what you're saying about the idea of brand, right? And I mean, we call it style in business, you call it brand. And when you say art world, what you're talking about is the market,
Mm.
and this idea of for a career, we're I mean, you should have a repeatable brand because people need to know what they're buying and curators want to know what they're showing. I did, when I was younger, I did a lot of looking at historical artists, and it seems like the ones like Gerhard Richter or Picasso, who become famous, are able to do it, but are able to shift, but the shifts come every like 2 to 4 years.
Mm.
And so it's interesting that they do hit the nail on the head, or like they repeat the same thing for 2 to 4 years, and I think that gives people enough time to start embracing what is happening. Ideally they probably need a little bit more time, but then you have the opposite problem where you have like I don't know too much about Stella, but like Frank Stella, that like try goes off kilter of what he became famous for, and people don't embrace it. And so that's sort of the opposite of that problem is, if you do become well known for something and you repeat it all the time, then you have a really hard time coming out of it. In any event, all that is to say that that is the market, which is much different from following your spirit, which is, I think, also a narrative that they tell you as a young artist, but not conducive necessarily to having an artistic career.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
we can spend a lot more time talking about that. I think about that a lot. And I am actually super interested in what you said about Instagram. I think Instagram is the most garbage medium, mostly because I don't understand how to do it well. I do it well enough, but I don't do it. I'm not successful at it in terms of gaining a following and all that. And so so it's interesting to hear that, like, you know, my talks are very well put together. I think I'll pat myself on the back, but I was raised as a public speaker. But I don't put that into the Instagram. And I don't weave narratives into the Instagram, which might be, but I don't understand how Instagram works. I think it's just all like vomiting information at people, and for better or worse, right? It's usually for worse.
Yeah. I have another question about, you said, and obviously I've again been in there, that not all of the paintings are presented in the exhibition. And what's also striking with the works when hung in the galleries is that they're titled by the date of your call. And depending on when people learn this information, as we know, not all exhibition texts and intro texts are read.
Oh, yeah.
Some of them have multiples. It's a date with a parentheses of 1 or 2, so indicating a set of siblings. How did you make the choice, or was it perhaps Jane within our exhibitions team, of which ones weren't going to be included in the show?
When we ran out of space.
Was it aesthetics? When you ran out of space. So sort of the more recent ones are maybe not presented then?
I heard a story about Christopher Wool, the artist. For a long time, he would only paint the size that would come out of his freight elevator.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this idea of like practical solutions to like really
Mm-hmm.
complex answers. Or like this idea that like we expect it to be like some convoluted answer, but really it's I ran out of space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was like the most clear way to cut, and the clear way to really, it's hard because I have such an emotional connection to the paintings.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, I mean, I do like some of them more than others, but like sometimes, you know, I'm someone who's always of two minds. So like if you come to me on a Saturday, I'll say, oh, this one is like a unique flower and it's so beautiful. And then you come to me on Sunday and I'm like, they're all the same. And they're totally interchangeable. And someone was just talking to me like, it was somebody came to the Lyman Allyn and was talking to one of the docents and said, what would happen if you hung them all upside down? Would it totally change all the narrative? I mean, I don't know, maybe like for her, I mean, again, it's probably a lot about how connected you are to that narrative, right? Like for someone coming in for the first time, if you flip it upside down, they wouldn't notice. But for her who came in and examined it, it would blow her mind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's and that's, you know, that also is kind of like an interesting analogy or lesson. Hey, right? How does that work? That like, in what part is our interest in a history? So like going back to the portraiture, like I found that series so engaging because you could have these multiple levels. Someone could come to the portraits and say, okay, like I recognize that guy and play the name game. Or someone could know a lot about Fidelia Hoscott Smith and dig into the symbology. And so you know, making something that has these multiple levels of engagement is what I really enjoy. Right? Did you have a question?
Hey, Jack. Less of a question. I wanted to pop in and just say hello and thank
Yeah.
you and Eileen for putting this on, because I didn't have a chance to make it up to the Lyman Allen to see the show. So, um, I also am a father like Jack, and thus am strapped for time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I would be up there in person. But I just want to say it's a great format. Jack and I have only met in person a handful of times, but I've cherished each time because there's so much thought and depth that goes into what he creates, and I think that um, the exhibition really demonstrates that. I forget how you put it, but when you walk in, you kind of have the curiosity. It kind of expands your imagination, but then it has these little moments that you can dive deeper into the meaning of the work. And we had the
105.
opportunity of showing an exhibition of Jack's earlier this year called The Saffron Thief. And I think more than any show we've hosted, you saw people walk in and their eyes open wide and their mind open wide. And whether that was, someone who was 4 or someone who was 84. And not a question. I just want to say hello and thank you for putting this on.
So Wright is the founder of Sugarlift Gallery in Chelsea, who together we put on this great show. And he was so lovely to let me bring kids in to smash artwork in the gallery. That was one of the first proper, white box spaces that I did this performance, and so I was very grateful for you allowing me to experiment in the space. But it was definitely a fabulous thing, and and something I really am enjoying continuing.
Yeah. We had fun with our art smash as well, but I'm hoping that you didn't have the same number of stressful conversations beforehand leading up to it. We had a lot of what are we saying if we're saying it's okay to damage artwork in a
Really
museum
interesting.
setting, but we used the photos from the Sugar Lift Art Smash to basically, with the final note that this is a joyful moment and that any other moments that you're witnessing of art being damaged is never a joyful moment. It's for distinct and particular purposes. And so we relied on those photos for our reasonings in favor.
Yeah, I thought that it was all like there was a little pushback at the beginning at the Lyman Allen to doing it in a proper museum white box space, and I thought it was all because we thought the kids were going to go rampaging and be evil beasts, but actually I think a lot of the more hesitancy was on the messaging of destroying artwork. um, and
Yeah.
and that is part of iconoclasm that I find so interesting. And
Hmm.
iconoclasm is both in the destruction of artwork, but the destruction of ideas, and how we can turn these situations on their head. Yeah.
Hmm. And the frequency in which people protesting various things are using the galleries as a space to gain attention for their messaging. And regardless of what that messaging is a big museum with artwork behind glass is able to still care for that artwork. And I think the protesters you hear about are also being careful about only choosing artworks that are behind glass for the
Yeah.
most part. Whereas, we're not in that same kind of environment and ability. So, but yeah, we had a good time with it at the end.
And right, I'll tell you that about an hour before this talk, I was called by daycare saying, "Come pick up your kid." And so I ran to go get the kid, and luckily this talk is happening during nap time. So our 2-year-old foster child is upstairs napping. Meanwhile, it's like every day is like another round of hiccups, but that's part of that like Vining story, right? And that me and Wright talked about that road trip idea, and Wright actually talked about the idea of also think about the bus. Like if you're on a road trip and you might not know your final destination, but think about who you're filling your car with, and who you're traveling with. And that's such a beautiful, like, thinking about the people that you're enjoying this journey with, is a great thing. And so I can also talk for just 2 seconds. I want to say sort of about what's next, because uh, it's become clear to me in the last year that I really work in series. I don't know why it was only clear to me now, but the 48 Jews large series, that's a traveling museum show. The Great Americans large series, that's a traveling museum show. These Foster paintings are really built for that, and I'm actually in talks with well, they're going to be traveling to Second Street Gallery in Charlottesville, Virginia. They're going to have a miniature version of this Lyman Allyn show with Foster paintings and some smash art. And so then the next up was also this series of record album covers, and so that you'll be seeing soon. But those are the paintings behind me. I just wanted to give a little shout out to. So I'm painting over 200 record album covers, sort of talking about pop history and culture, and we're hoping that early to mid 2024 there's going to be a big show on the horizon. So any other questions? Not about that in specific, but Cynthia, are you poking?
I just would like you to tell me about the plaque in the museum underneath the Foxy painting. Does it actually
Oh,
does it
sorry.
actually does it actually identify it as a jackal?
Mm-hmm. It's the painting is titled Foxy, and then in parentheses blackback jackal, and then
Okay,
the text talks about the blackback jackal.
great.
My bio son's middle name is Fox,
Ah,
and so for some reason the fox just sort of stuck out to me. But I also love this idea of the misnomer, and
me
like
too.
yeah, and so like you're directing someone's attention to something, but it's not really that thing, and it's close enough. But does it matter? I mean, that's another um, question. Some of these ideas of facts can be foggy, and and what is our use of them versus, or like if the paintings are all hung upside down, like does it matter? Um,
It matters.
it matters exactly.
I came in at a point where you were talking about the leaves, and I don't know what material you used for it. So could you just talk about the leaves and the vines?
Let me get to the good picture of it. Yeah, so the leaves are made out of felt. It's actually an extremely laborious process, and I always question if I should be doing it. But they're hand cut out of felt, and then they're hot glued onto floral wire, which are then wrapped around the vines, and the vines are all it's rope that is then bound in wire to give it some sort of form, and then wrapped in athletic tape to give it a papery surface, and then painted. So it's a process. And I guess that's again, right, like talking before about, like, I love it when these really complex things look, I mean, I don't know if this looks easy, but like looks natural, right? Like it's a very complex, labored process, but then it looks natural. And that can be maybe an analogy for nurturing and kids, is that like our kid just turned 7 yesterday, and it looks so easy having a birthday party at 7, but then all the labor that went into that, and all the sick days of getting called from daycare, and then having to, like, tomorrow our kid's not going to be in school because they got called home sick. So that throws us for a loop.
So I have to say that you were noticing and experiencing a lot of things that usually fall upon women in our society. And it's the idea of women who are overwhelmed trying to work and also uh, do child raising and all that kind of stuff too. Also, can I just ask you, because it seems that the color blue actually showed up a lot in your portraits, but is it Eve Klein blue, or is it a special, like what significance does this blue color have to you? Because it's pretty phenomenal.
I most of what I use is ultramarine, but it's a specific ultramarine in flash paint. So again, we talk about materiality. So flash, all paint is basically a binder and a pigment. The binder is usually like oil paint is an oil binder. Acrylic paint is an acrylic, which is basically plastic binder. And then flash is a vinyl binder, and that allows it to have a much higher pigment content. So when you see them in person, the flash actually looks very velvety. And I thought that that was also part of why I started getting this velvet printed. So it's this like repetition there of like a medium trying to be another medium. Um, and then there's also like a lot of cerulean, I guess, in there. But the idea that Yves Klein called a blue after himself, and then this is what it is pretty amazing. But it's basically ultramarine. But ultramarine is a funny color in that it's like it often appears much darker than images of ultramarine. Um, and so that's where I made a distinction that the ultramarine in flash paint is a very, very vibrant blue. It's like that Yves Klein vibrancy. And I think that's part of where, why he has such a stranglehold over the name is because his blue is so vibrant, and but it's basically an ultramarine in my eyes. So Allyn, did you look at, I didn't look at the comments, but
Um, Not any specific questions, but what I started dropping in were some of our advocacy and donation links. So this exhibition with Jac is in part sponsored by the Community Foundation of Eastern Connecticut, who, when we were applying through the granting process, challenged Jac and the museum to see how can we bring a temporary exhibition into our practice for the full year. And so it includes a little bit of obviously advocacy for foster children and, well, foster and adoptive and family care situations. So we've dropped in the link. We're hoping to help KFAF, the Connecticut Alliance of Foster and Adoptive Families, with some of their Hope Fund fundraising. The Lyman Allyn is collecting on-site items for Bags of Hope, an organization that helps to provide bags and materials for children within foster care. And the Lyman Allyn is providing family memberships to anyone who is working in care situations, be it foster, adoptive, or other kinds of family care, to help you continue to engage with the museum during the coming year. So those were the links I've dropped in.
Yep. And I'd like to really thank thank you all for showing up, and thank you to the Lyman Allyn Museum for helping put this together. And I know it was sort of outside of their wheelhouse in in a lot of different ways, but they really embraced it. And I think the people coming through have engaged it. As Wright said, like you see the difference in people's eyes when they're looking at something with wonder and with surprise. And that is something sort of new that, normally making the portraiture, this is where the divergence in the practice happened. But making the portraiture, people come up to it, they appreciate it as art. It's an intellectual exercise, but you don't get that same idea of wonder and joy, and trying to trigger that a little bit in the artwork is that's one of the things that I'm doing now. So exciting. Well, I think we're at an hour, Allyn. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon.